It took me 8 years to understand that the peace in my own home was a carefully crafted poison. Another 6 months to realize the only antidote was a war I never wanted to fight. But a man will do anything to save the woman he loves, especially when he finally sees she is drowning right in front of him in the calm, quiet waters of her own living room. It all began on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. The sun, a soft, buttery yellow, streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the dancing dust motes in its path. I sat in my favorite worn leather armchair, the one that had molded to the shape of my body over 30 years of reading newspapers and worrying about life. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee, rich and dark, hung in the air, a scent that for me was synonymous with home, with safety, with my wife Eleanor. Across the room, Eleanor was arranging a bouquet of yellow tulips in a crystal vase. At 70 years old, she still moved with a quiet grace that had captivated me since the first day I saw her. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, and she hummed a soft, barely audible tune, a melody from a time when this house was filled only with our own music. The scene was a portrait of domestic tranquility, a perfect picture of the golden years we had worked our whole lives to achieve. But a picture can be a beautiful lie. I lowered my newspaper and truly watched her for the first time in a long while. The first thing I noticed was the thermostat on the far wall. It read 68 degrees. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept over my skin. Eleanor loved a warm house. 74 degrees was her sweet spot, the temperature of comfort. 68 was Jasmine's preference. For 8 years, my wife had worn a cardigan in her own home, a silent concession to a battle she never fought. My gaze drifted around the room. The walls, once a warm cream color and adorned with framed photographs of our life together, of our son David growing up, of holidays and anniversaries, were now a sterile, fashionable gray. Most of our pictures were gone, replaced by abstract art prints with sharp lines and cold colors. Jasmine had called it decluttering. She said it gave the space a more modern, clean feel. At the time, I had merely shrugged. A man doesn't argue about paint colors and picture frames. But now, sitting in the silence, I felt the truth of it. It wasn't decluttering. It was erasure. They were slowly, methodically erasing us from our own home. The television was on muted, but I knew what channel it was. A reality show filled with screaming women and manufactured drama. Jasmine's morning ritual. Before she had moved in, our mornings were filled with the sound of classical music from the public radio station, a gentle entry into the day. Now it was a constant, silent flicker of conflict in the corner of our vision. I looked back at Eleanor in the kitchen. She moved with a strange hesitation, a cautiousness that did not belong to the owner of a space. She opened a cupboard, took out a mug, and closed it with a soft click, as if afraid to make too much noise. She wiped down a countertop that was already spotless. She seemed smaller, somehow diminished. She was a guest in her own kitchen. Eleanor. I said, my voice softer than I intended. She turned a gentle smile gracing her lips, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes looked tired. Yes, James. The tulips are beautiful, I told her, aren't they? They remind me of the garden at our first apartment, she said, her voice filled with a warmth that the room now lacked. For a moment, the sterile gray walls seemed to fade, and I could almost smell the blossoms from that long-ago garden. Are you cold, honey? You're wearing that thick sweater again. She instinctively pulled the cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Oh no, I'm perfectly fine. Just a little morning chill. Another beautiful lie told to keep a peace that was costing her everything. I wanted to get up to walk over to the thermostat and defiantly push the temperature up to 74. I wanted to take down the cold, meaningless prints and hang our memories back on the walls. I wanted to tell her that she didn't have to lie to me, that this was her house. But I didn't. The habit of capitulation, of choosing quiet over comfort, was a deeply ingrained one. For 8 years I had told myself I was being a good father, a supportive husband, a peacekeeper. I was a fool. I was an accomplice. The sound of footsteps on the stairs broke the quiet tension. David and Jasmine appeared ready for their day. David, our son, tall and handsome, but with a weakness in his posture I hadn't noticed before. And Jasmine, his wife, perfectly put together, her smile as bright and hard as a diamond. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The gentle quiet became a waiting silence. Morning, David said, heading straight for the coffee pot. Jasmine's eyes scanned the room, her gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on the tulips. Oh, Eleanor. Flowers again. They do attract so much dust. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a judgment. Eleanor's smile faltered. I just thought they brightened up the place. The place is plenty bright, Jasmine replied, turning her attention to the television and unmuting it. The sound of a shrill argument filled the room, shattering the last remnants of our morning peace. David didn't flinch. He just poured his coffee, his back to all of us, a silent supporter of his wife's quiet campaign of domestic tyranny. He took a sip from his mug. This coffee tastes a bit burnt today, Mom, he said, not unkindly, but with the casual thoughtlessness that had become his defining trait. Oh, I'm sorry, dear. I made it the same way I always do, Eleanor murmured, already moving to inspect the machine, taking the blame for something that wasn't her fault. It was a new blend of coffee, one Jasmine had insisted on buying. I opened my mouth to say something to defend her, to point out the small constant aggressions. But what would I say? That a comment about coffee was an act of war, that the temperature of a room was a measure of my wife's dwindling spirit. They would look at me as if I were losing my mind. And so, like all the mornings before, I said nothing. I just sat there clutching my newspaper, the headlines blurring before my eyes. I sat in silence as my wife apologized for existing too loudly in her own home. It was a perfectly normal Tuesday morning, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that we couldn't survive many more of them. The poison was working. The air in the room was thick with unspoken resentments. The vapid chatter from the television filled a silence that had become heavier than any sound. Eleanor, bless her heart, tried to smooth things over as she always did. She gave David a sad, placating smile and turned her attention to the small bassinet nestled in the corner near the fireplace. Our grandson Noah had begun to stir his tiny fists, bunching and unbunching in his sleep. A soft crocheted blanket one Eleanor had made herself had slipped from his shoulder, leaving him exposed to the artificial chill of the room. With the quiet, natural instinct of a grandmother, Eleanor moved toward him. Her steps were soft on the hardwood floor. Her intention was as pure as gold. All she wanted was to gently tuck the blanket back into place to ensure the comfort of the child she adored. She was humming that old tune again, a quiet act of defiance, a way of reclaiming a small piece of her own atmosphere. I watched her, a warmth spreading through my chest, a brief respite from the cold anger I felt moments before. It was a simple, beautiful gesture, a grandmother caring for her grandson. It was the kind of moment that should have been the bedrock of our family life. But I had forgotten in my years of willful ignorance that our foundation was built on sand, and our daughter-in-law was the coming tide. Jasmine's head snapped in Eleanor's direction. Her eyes, which had been idly watching the television, narrowed into slits, a predator's focus. I saw her body tense, the muscles in her jaw tightening. She moved with a speed that was unnerving, crossing the living room in 3 quick, silent strides. She didn't speak. She didn't warn. She acted. She swooped in like a hawk, diving for its prey, her hands outstretched. It wasn't a gentle interception. It was an assault. She planted both her palms squarely on Eleanor's fragile shoulder and shoved, hard. Time seemed to warp, stretching the moment into an eternity of horror. I saw the look of utter shock on Eleanor's face, her soft brown eyes widening, first in confusion, then in hurt, and finally in fear as her body was thrown off balance. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp. Her arm, the one holding her cardigan closed, flew out, grasping at empty air. Her hip crashed into the small mahogany end table that had stood beside my armchair for decades. The crystal vase of yellow tulips wobbled for a sickening second, a miniature tower leaning against a skyline of domestic chaos. Then it tipped. It fell through the air in a graceful, terrible arc, water sloshing out in a silver spray that caught the morning light. It hit the floor with a sound that was both deafening and delicate, an explosion of crystalline memory. Shards of glass skittered across the wood like scattered diamonds. The tulips lay bruised and broken amidst the wreckage, their bright yellow a stark contrast to the ugliness of the moment. Eleanor crumpled to the floor. It wasn't a dramatic fall, but a slow, heartbreaking collapse, as if her bones had suddenly given way. She landed on the Persian rug with a soft, muffled thud, a quiet sound that was somehow more violent than a crash. A pained cry, small and wounded, escaped her lips as she cradled her wrist. The newspaper slipped from my own numb fingers and pooled at my feet. The world narrowed to the sight of my wife, my elegant, gentle Eleanor, lying on the floor of her own home, amidst the shattered remnants of her morning's small joy. A thick, ringing silence descended, broken only by the tinny laughter of the reality show characters on the television. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Jasmine, standing over my wife, her posture rigid and victorious, finally spoke. Her voice was not panicked or apologetic. It was cold, sharp, and dripping with a venom that I had failed to see for 8 long years. "Don't you dare touch him," she hissed, her words cutting through the silence like shards of the broken vase. She looked down at Eleanor not with concern, but with pure, unadulterated contempt. "Your hands are filthy." For a long moment, the only sound was the hollow echo of Jasmine's words hanging in the air. "Your hands are filthy." The sheer cruelty of it was a physical force, a wave of malice that seemed to suck the very air from the room. The spell of my inaction was broken. A cold fire ignited in my veins, burning away the 8 years of passivity and peacekeeping. I moved toward my wife, kneeling beside her on the rug amidst the debris of her flowers. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of pain and profound disbelief. I gently took her arm, helping her into a sitting position. Her wrist was already beginning to swell. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" I asked, my voice low and tight with a rage I barely contained. She nodded, though a single tear traced a path down her cheek. "I think so," she whispered, her voice trembling. I looked up at Jasmine, who stood there with her arms crossed, a mask of self-righteous indignation on her face. There was no remorse in her eyes, no concern, only a chilling sort of triumph. "What is wrong with you?" I said, each word a block of ice. Before she could answer, David rushed into the room, his phone still in his hand, his face a canvas of alarm. "What happened?" I heard a crash. His eyes darted from the shattered vase to his mother on the floor, and then to his wife's defiant stance. For a fleeting second, I saw confusion in his expression, a moment where the sun I raised might have surfaced. But it was gone in an instant, snuffed out by the performance that was about to begin. Jasmine's face crumpled. The hard, cruel lines dissolved into a portrait of a victim. Tears welled in her eyes and began to stream down her cheeks in perfect, glistening trails. She let out a gut-wrenching sob that sounded utterly convincing if you didn't know the truth. "Oh, David," she cried, rushing to him and burying her face in his chest. "It was horrible. Your mother, she was stumbling near the bassinet. I was so scared she was going to fall on Noah. I just reacted. I reached out to steady her and she must have lost her balance. I didn't mean for her to fall." David wrapped his arms around her instantly, stroking her hair, murmuring comforting words. He didn't once look at his own mother, still sitting on the floor. He absorbed his wife's version of reality without question, his loyalty as swift as it was absolute. After a moment, he looked over at us, his expression not one of concern for Eleanor, but of tired frustration, as if we were the ones causing the problem. "Mom," he said, his voice laced with a condescending gentleness that was more insulting than a shout. "It's okay. It was an accident. You know you've been a little unsteady on your feet lately. We've talked about this." Eleanor, with my help, was now standing. She looked at her son, her own flesh and blood, with a deep, pleading hurt in her eyes. "David, that's not what happened," she said, her voice stronger now. "She pushed me. It was not an accident." David sighed, a deep, theatrical sound of exasperation. He disentangled himself from Jasmine and walked toward us, shaking his head slowly. "Mom, please. Your memory, you know it's not what it used to be. You probably just tripped and don't remember it correctly. It's okay. Nobody is blaming you." And there it was. The final brutal piece of the puzzle sliding into place. It wasn't just a shove. It wasn't just a cruel insult. It was a calculated campaign. The comments about her forgetfulness, the rearranging of the house, the constant subtle corrections, it was all designed to make her doubt herself, to make us doubt her. They were building a narrative brick by brick that Eleanor was becoming incompetent. And I stood there watching my son, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose fears I had soothed in the night, as he wielded this psychological weapon against his own mother with practiced ease. This was not a one-time betrayal. This was a strategy. And my son was not a peacekeeper caught in the middle. He was a willing, active accomplice. As I stood there in the wreckage of our Tuesday morning, watching my son soothe the woman who had just assaulted his mother, my mind spun backward. It was a desperate search for an origin point, for the first crack in our foundation where the poison could have seeped in. My memory flew past years of holidays and birthdays, past the birth of my grandson, all the way back to a rainy autumn evening 8 years ago. The evening the peace in our home officially ended, though we were too blind to see it at the time. Eleanor and I had been sitting in the living room, a comfortable silence between us. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow on the walls. I was reading a book on history, and Eleanor was knitting a small blue sweater, humming that same soft tune. The house was a sanctuary, a quiet harbor we had built together over 40 years of marriage. The world outside could rage, but within these walls there was only warmth and an unshakable sense of belonging. Then the doorbell rang. Its chime cut through the quiet, unexpected and jarring. We looked at each other, a silent question passing between us. We weren't expecting anyone. I opened the door to a sight that squeezed my heart like a fist. Our son David and his wife Jasmine stood on our doorstep looking like two shipwreck survivors washed ashore. The autumn rain had plastered their hair to their foreheads and darkened their jackets. David's shoulders, which I had always seen as strong and broad, were slumped in defeat. His eyes, usually so bright and full of ambitious fire, were dull and hollow. Jasmine stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself, trying to project an image of strength that was betrayed by the slight tremor in her chin. They had two large suitcases standing beside them, looking heavy and final. David, Jasmine. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked, her voice laced with immediate maternal concern as she came to stand beside me. David couldn't seem to meet my eyes. He stared at a point somewhere over my shoulder. "Dad, Mom, can we come in?" His voice was hoarse, heavy with a shame that was painful to witness. "Of course, son, get in out of this rain," I said, stepping back and ushering them into the warmth of our home. Eleanor immediately went to them, taking their damp coats, her hands fluttering with worry. We sat them down on the sofa, the same sofa where this morning's drama had unfolded. Eleanor brought them warm mugs of tea. For a long time, David just stared into his cup. Finally, he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush of failure and despair. The tech startup he had poured all his money and dreams into had gone bankrupt. They had lost everything. Their savings, their car, and last week their trendy downtown apartment. They had been staying with friends, but they had overstayed their welcome. They had nowhere else to go. "Dad, I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I messed up. I messed everything up." Jasmine, who had been silent until then, placed a hand on his arm and looked at us, her eyes welling with expertly timed tears. "We've hit rock bottom, James," she said, using my first name in that way that always felt more like a strategy than intimacy. "We just need a place to stay for a little while, just for a few months. Just until David can find a new job and we can get back on our feet. We won't be a burden, I promise. Just for a few months." The words hung in the air, a seemingly harmless request. I looked at Eleanor. I saw her heart breaking for our son, her face a mask of unconditional love and compassion. I saw no hesitation in her eyes, no doubt, and I felt the same powerful primal instinct. This was our child. He was hurting. He was in need. In that moment, all his failures, all his poor decisions, they didn't matter. You don't lecture a drowning man about why his boat sank. You throw him a rope. "This is your home, son," I said, my voice firm with a conviction that now feels like the height of foolishness. "You are always welcome here." Eleanor got up and hugged him tightly. "Of course you're staying with us. Don't you worry about a thing. We'll figure this all out together as a family." That night, we helped them carry their heavy suitcases up to the guest room. Eleanor made up the bed with her best linens, the ones she saved for special company. She even placed a small vase of flowers from her garden on the nightstand. They were gestures of love, of a boundless, naive generosity. We thought we were providing a safe harbor for our son. We had no idea we were willingly handing over our sanctuary to a pirate. The promise of a few months became a mirage on the horizon, a destination we never seemed to reach. Those first months bled into a year, then 2, then 3. The initial gratitude David and Jasmine had shown on that rainy night slowly began to curdle. It transformed day by day into something that looked less like appreciation and more like expectation. Their presence, which had at first felt temporary, became a permanent feature of our home, and with that permanence came a quiet, insidious campaign to reshape our life into one that better suited them. It happened so gradually in a series of small, almost insignificant battles that I barely registered we were at war. I see it clearly now, a map of strategic annexations. The first territory to fall was the kitchen. It happened about a year after they moved in. The kitchen had always been Eleanor's sanctuary, the heart of our home. It was filled with the tools of her love chief, among them a set of heavy black cast iron pans. They weren't just cookware, they were history. They had belonged to her grandmother, and they held the phantom flavors of 100 years of family meals. Sunday morning pancakes, Thanksgiving gravy, the perfect sear on a steak. Eleanor cherished them. One afternoon, I came home to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen, her expression lost and confused. She was opening and closing cupboards, a small frown on her face. "I can't find them, James," she said. "My skillets. They're gone." Just then Jasmine walked in, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Oh, the old black thing," she said, her voice as bright and cheerful as a spring morning. "I finally got rid of them for you, Eleanor. I was doing a deep clean. You wouldn't believe the amount of rust and old caked on grease. So unhygienic. Modern non-stick is so much better for your health and much easier to clean." She smiled a triumphant, helpful smile, as if she had just done my wife a tremendous favor. She had spoken of a family heirloom as if it were a piece of trash. I watched as the light in Eleanor's eyes dimmed. She looked at the empty space where the pans used to hang her shoulders, slumping just a little. She didn't argue. She didn't fight. She was a woman from a generation that was taught to keep the peace at all costs. "Oh," she said softly, "that's thoughtful of you, dear." I saw the hurt she was trying to hide, but I said nothing. I told myself it was just a set of pans. I told myself Jasmine was probably right about the health concerns. I chose the easy quiet over the difficult truth. I chose to ignore that my wife's history had just been thrown out with the trash. 2 years later, they took Christmas. Eleanor and I had always loved Christmas Eve. We had our traditions. A quiet dinner with a few old friends, Bing Crosby singing on the record player, the scent of roast turkey and pine needles filling the house. That December, as we were planning our simple celebration, Jasmine overheard us. "Oh, that sounds a little dated, don't you think?" she said, wrinkling her nose. "So quiet. We should have a real party, something fun with some energy." Before we could protest, she had taken over. She created a group chat, sent out digital invitations. Our quiet dinner for 6 became a loud, crowded party for 50. Christmas Eve arrived, and our house was filled with strangers. Young, loud people from Jasmine and David's world, people whose names we didn't know and whose faces we didn't recognize. The air was thick with the scent of strange perfumes and the thumping bass of music I'd never heard. Eleanor and I were reduced to staff. We spent the evening in the kitchen refilling bowls of chips and bringing out trays of appetizers Jasmine had ordered. At one point, we stood in the corner of our own living room, holding plates of food we didn't want, watching these strangers laugh and drink in the space where we had raised our son. We were ghosts at our own feast. I looked for David and saw him in the center of the largest group, a drink in his hand, laughing at some story. He didn't look our way once. He was the king of a court that had deposed us. The 5th year brought the most blatant betrayal yet. I was walking back from the mailbox one afternoon, flipping through the mail. The electric bill, the water bill, the internet bill, all addressed to me, all paid for by me. As I stood there, a sleek, brand-new black SUV, the kind that costs more than my first 2 houses combined, pulled into our driveway. David hopped out, a proud, boyish grin on his face, dangling a new set of keys. My heart sank. I tried to keep my voice even. "That's a new car, son." "Isn't she a beauty, Dad?" he said, patting the hood. "It must have cost a fortune," I said, holding up the bills in my hand. "I'm just wondering how you can afford this when Eleanor and I are still covering your basic household expenses." His smile vanished, replaced by a defensive scowl. "It's for work, Dad. You wouldn't understand. It's about projecting an image of success. It's a lease anyway, a business expense. You have to spend money to make money." He spoke to me with a dismissive impatience, as if I were a clueless old man who didn't understand the complexities of the modern world. He who was living under my roof for free was lecturing me on finance. The conversation ended there. He brushed past me and went inside, leaving me standing in the driveway with the evidence of his profound irresponsibility in my hands. It was then I knew. Our generosity wasn't a lifeline helping him swim. It was a lead weight dragging us all down into a sea of his entitlement. The new car was a monument to their disrespect, a gleaming black symbol of their entitlement parked in our driveway. But the financial betrayals, as painful as they were merely skirmishes. The real war, the final brutal campaign of their silent invasion, was waged directly against Eleanor's spirit. The last few years were no longer about annexation, about taking over territory in our home. They were about total annihilation. The goal was to erase the woman my wife had once been, to break her down so completely that she would become a ghost in her own life, a silent, compliant fixture who gave them no trouble. The first major offensive in this final campaign was the destruction of her friendships. Eleanor had been part of a book club for over 30 years. It was more than just a club. It was a sisterhood. These 7 women had seen each other through everything, raising children, losing parents, celebrating triumphs and mourning losses. Once a month they would meet at one of their homes. When it was Eleanor's turn to host, our house would fill with the warm, wonderful sound of intelligent women laughing and debating. She would spend the whole day preparing baking her famous lemon cookies, arranging chairs in the living room, her face lit with an excitement I rarely saw anymore. About 2 years ago, the book club arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The women were all there, settled in the living room with their tea and cookies, the atmosphere cheerful and alive. Eleanor was glowing. 10 minutes into their discussion, Jasmine emerged from the guest room, which she had converted into a home office. She was wearing large, expensive headphones, but the music was so loud we could all hear the aggressive thumping bass. She paid the guests no mind, as if they were invisible pieces of furniture. She walked directly to the large Bluetooth speaker we kept on the bookshelf, connected her phone, and the room was suddenly blasted with a torrent of angry, profanity-laden rap music at a deafening volume. The polite conversation of the book club came to an immediate halt. The women looked around in stunned silence. Eleanor, her face flushed with embarrassment, went over to Jasmine. "Jasmine, dear," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise, "could you please turn that down? I have guests." Jasmine pulled off her headphones and gave Eleanor a look of pure theatrical disbelief. "I'm sorry. Am I not allowed to listen to music in my own home?" she asked loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I have a deadline. This is how I focus." She didn't lower the volume. If anything, it felt like it got louder. The women tried to continue leaning in and shouting over the music, but the mood was shattered. The warmth and intimacy were gone, replaced by a tense, unbearable awkwardness. Within 20 minutes, they began making their excuses. They hugged Eleanor at the door, their faces a mixture of pity and sadness. I watched from the hallway as the last of her friends left. They never came back. I had been in my study the whole time pretending to read, telling myself it wasn't my place to interfere. The final decisive blow came after Noah was born. Being a grandmother was something Eleanor had looked forward to for years. She envisioned herself in the kitchen teaching her grandchild how to bake, passing down the recipes that had been in our family for generations. The kitchen was her last remaining sanctuary, the one place she still felt some measure of control and purpose. Jasmine took that from her with surgical precision. One afternoon, about a month before the incident with the shove, Eleanor was in the kitchen humming as she prepared a chicken soup from scratch. It was the same recipe her mother had made for her, the one she had made for David every time he was sick as a child. The rich, healing aroma filled the house. Jasmine walked in holding Noah. She watched Eleanor for a moment, her expression like that of a health inspector finding a violation. Then she spoke, her voice condescendingly sweet, a tone designed to sound like she was being helpful and concerned. "Eleanor," she began, "I know you mean well, and I really do appreciate the thought. But we have to be so much more careful now that Noah is here. Your methods in the kitchen are a bit old-fashioned. All these wooden spoons and that old cutting board. We just can't risk any cross-contamination or germs with the baby's immune system being so fragile. So to be safe, I think it's best if I handle all the cooking from now on. I hope you understand." It was the perfect trap, a checkmate. She had used the baby, the one thing Eleanor loved unconditionally, as a weapon. How could Eleanor argue? How could she protest without looking like she didn't care about the health of her own grandson? She couldn't. I saw the fight go out of her completely. She silently untied the strings of her favorite apron, the one with the hand-embroidered flowers, folded it neatly and placed it on the counter. She then turned and walked out of the kitchen without a word. She never cooked another meal in that house again. After that day, the change in her was profound. She retreated. The bedroom became her world. I would come home from running errands and the house would be silent. I would find her there sitting in the armchair by the window, staring out at a world she no longer seemed to be a part of. She wasn't reading or knitting, she was just sitting. One evening I walked in and asked if she was okay. She turned to look at me and I was struck by the utter emptiness in her eyes. The gentle light that had defined her for 50 years was gone. It had been extinguished deliberately and methodically. She gave me a small, tired smile. "I'm just resting, James." In that moment, I understood everything. I saw the entire 8-year campaign laid out before me. The pans, the party, the friends, the kitchen. It was all one long, sustained attack. And I, in my desire for a quiet life, in my cowardly avoidance of conflict, had stood by and let it happen. My silence had not been peacekeeping, it was complicity. I was an accomplice to the slow, methodical erasure of the woman I loved more than life itself. The man who went to bed that Tuesday night was not the same man who woke up on Wednesday morning. The man who went to bed was a husband filled with a helpless, sputtering rage, a father grieving a betrayal so deep it felt like a physical wound. The man who woke up was a strategist. The grief and rage had not disappeared. They had cooled and hardened overnight into something else entirely. Something cold, patient, and sharp. The peacekeeper in me, the man who had spent 8 years sacrificing his wife's happiness on the altar of a false family harmony, had died. In his place stood a protector, and his mission was singular: to gather the truth and to use that truth as a weapon. The atmosphere at the breakfast table was a thick, unbreathable fog of tension. Jasmine was engaged in a sickeningly sweet performance, fluttering around Eleanor, asking if she needed more tea, if her wrist was feeling better, her voice dripping with a concern that was utterly false. Eleanor, ever the lady, was polite but distant. David avoided looking at any of us staring into his oatmeal as if it held the secrets of the universe. He was a coward, and for the first time in his life I felt a flicker of contempt for my own son. I waited for them all to be seated, then I cleared my throat and I lied. Eleanor and I will be going away for a few days, I announced, my voice calm and steady. I finally got a call back from that specialist over in Westfield, the one for your arthritis, honey. They had a cancellation and can see you on Friday. I figured we would drive out tomorrow, take our time, and make a little trip of it. We'll be back on Sunday. Eleanor looked at me, her eyes filled with a gentle confusion. We had never discussed a specialist in Westfield. I gave her a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head, a silent plea for her to trust me. She, in that way that was the bedrock of our 50-year partnership, simply nodded. "Oh," she said. That's good news, James." I saw the flicker of relief in Jasmine's eyes. She almost managed to hide it. The idea of having the house to herself, free from our watchful eyes for 4 days, clearly delighted her. "That's wonderful, Eleanor," she said, her smile wide and brilliant. "You two deserve a break. Don't you worry about a thing here. We'll take care of everything." I had no doubt that she would. My first stop that morning was not the pharmacy or the bank. It was a sprawling, brightly lit electronics store in a strip mall on the other side of town. I felt like a spy in a foreign country, surrounded by a dizzying array of gadgets and technology I didn't understand. Teenagers in store uniforms bustled past me, speaking a language of gigabytes and frame rates. I walked through the aisles feeling old and out of place until I found the section marked Home Security. A young man with kind eyes and a name tag that read Kevin approached me. "Can I help you find something, sir?" I had rehearsed my story. "I'm looking for a security camera," I said, trying to sound casual. "Something for my workshop out back. I'm worried about some kids in the neighborhood. I need it to be unnoticeable, and it needs to have very clear audio." Kevin nodded, all business. He led me to a display of devices that looked like something out of a spy movie. Cameras disguised as smoke detectors, as USB chargers, as picture frames. He showed me one, a tiny black cube no bigger than a sugar cube. "This is our best seller for discreet surveillance," he explained. "The battery lasts for 72 hours of continuous recording. It connects to an app on your phone so you can watch a live feed from anywhere. It records in high definition, and the microphone can pick up a whisper from 20 feet away." It was perfect. It was a silent, unblinking witness. "I'll take it," I said, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. When I got home, Eleanor was in our bedroom, dutifully packing a small overnight bag. She looked at me with worried eyes. "James, what is this all about?" "There is no doctor in Westfield." I took her hand. It felt so small and fragile in mine. "I know, my love," I said softly. "But there is a sickness in this house, and I promise you I am going to cure it. I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" She searched my face for a long moment, and then she nodded. I waited until David and Jasmine left to go to the gym, their daily ritual. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, my operation began. My target was the old grandfather clock that stood in the corner of the living room. It had been in my family for 3 generations. It had chimed the hours over countless family dinners, holidays, and quiet evenings. It was a silent, steadfast witness to our entire life in that house. It was also the perfect hiding place. My hands, surprisingly, were steady. I opened the tall wooden door at the front of the clock, the familiar scent of old wood and lemon oil greeting me. Inside, behind the heavy, swinging pendulum, was a small, dark space. Using a piece of double-sided tape, I secured the tiny camera to an interior brace just above the 12 on the clock's face. The wood was ornately carved, and a small, natural gap in the scrollwork no bigger than a pinhole provided the perfect peephole for the camera's tiny lens. I took out my phone, opened the app Kevin had helped me install, and a crystal-clear, wide-angle view of our living room appeared on the screen. It captured everything. The sofa, the armchairs, the entrance from the hallway. I held my breath, watching the empty room on my phone. The unseen eye was now open. It was watching. It was waiting. We checked into a modest motel in Westfield, a clean, anonymous place that smelled of disinfectant and old carpets. Eleanor, believing we were there for a genuine medical reason, lay down to rest the long day and the underlying stress having taken their toll on her. I watched her for a moment, her breathing soft and even in sleep, and a wave of protective love so fierce it almost brought me to my knees, washed over me. The sickness in our house was a cancer, and my wife was its primary victim. I would cut it out no matter the cost. I retreated to the small, dimly lit desk in the corner of the room, took out my phone, and with a hand that trembled slightly, I opened the application. The screen flickered for a second, and then the familiar, static, wide-angle view of my own living room materialized, seen from the unblinking eye of the grandfather clock. For the first hour, I watched the mundane reality of their lives when they believed they were alone. Jasmine kicked off her shoes and propped her bare feet up on the solid oak coffee table, a piece of furniture Eleanor had polished with lemon oil every week for 40 years. David came in and turned on a loud, mindless action movie. Jasmine immediately snatched the remote and changed the channel to her reality show. He didn't protest. He just sighed and sank into the sofa. I saw her pick up one of Eleanor's cherished porcelain birds from the mantelpiece, examine it with a sneer of distaste, and toss it back with a carelessness that made my jaw clench. These were the small, constant acts of disrespect, the death by 1,000 cuts that had been draining the life from my wife. It was ugly to watch, but it was not yet the proof I needed. I kept watching. Around 7 o'clock, David went to the kitchen to make dinner. Jasmine stayed in the living room and her phone rang. I saw her glance at the caller ID and a wide conspiratorial grin spread across her face. She answered, putting the call on speakerphone. The voice of a woman, loud and sharp, filled my motel room. So the friend asked, "How's life in paradise? Are the old folks finally gone?" Jasmine laughed, a sound that was coarse and ugly. "For the weekend, Tiff, it's glorious. I can finally breathe. Honestly, it's the perfect setup. Free house, free food, a built-in babysitter who I have trained to be terrified of her own shadow. It took years, but I finally have them completely tamed." "And what about David?" the friend asked. "Is he still completely clueless?" "Oh, honey, please," Jasmine scoffed. "David is so wrapped around my little finger he would believe me if I told him the sky was green. All I have to do is shed a few tears and he turns into my personal little guard dog. He'd defend me even if he saw me robbing a bank. He's completely loyal to me, not them." It's actually kind of pathetic. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to grip the edge of the desk. To hear her speak of our love, our home, our son with such calculated, gleeful contempt was like swallowing poison. This was not the frustrated daughter-in-law I had imagined. This was a predator proud of her conquest. I forced myself to keep watching, to keep listening. The call with her friend ended, but my ordeal was far from over. 20 minutes later, her phone rang again. This time, she didn't put it on speaker. She held it up to her ear, but the camera's microphone was as good as the young man had promised. I could hear her side of the conversation with perfect, horrifying clarity. Her voice had changed. It was no longer boastful and loud. It was low, quiet, and all business. "Is that you?" she said. "Good. Listen, everything is going perfectly just like we planned." There was a pause. "The incident the other day with the old woman was the final nail in the coffin. David is now completely convinced his mother is losing her mind. He's the one who is now suggesting we need to look into getting her some professional help. He's doing my work for me." She listened again, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. "Did you get the legal papers drawn up? The ones for the power of attorney. I need them to be ironclad." My blood ran cold. Power of attorney. This was worse than I had ever imagined. Her voice dropped even lower. "And what about the doctor you mentioned? The one for the mental health evaluation. Is he reliable? You're sure he'll sign off on what we need? I can't have any loose ends." Another pause. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her movements calm and deliberate. "Excellent. Because once she's declared legally incompetent and I have power of attorney over her affairs, we can finally move her into a long-term care facility. A nice affordable one out of state. David will be upset at first, but he'll think he's doing the right thing for his poor sick mother. After that, getting him to sign over the deed to the house will be child's play. He'll be too grief-stricken to read the fine print." The phone in my hand felt slick with sweat. I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just about taking over our home. This was a premeditated plot to strip my wife of her rights, her dignity, her freedom, and to lock her away for the rest of her life. They were going to steal my wife and then steal my house. The man on the other end of the line was not a friend. He was a co-conspirator. The call ended. Jasmine stood up, stretched like a cat, and walked into the kitchen, completely unaware that her entire monstrous plan had just been laid bare. I didn't turn off the feed. I pressed rewind. I watched the entire thing again, the sound of her voice, a venomous hiss in the quiet motel room. And then I watched it a third time. The initial shock that had paralyzed me began to recede. The profound, heartbreaking pain began to burn away. And in its place, something new and terrible began to grow. A cold, hard, and unforgiving fury. The grief was gone, replaced by a clarity so absolute it felt like a religious awakening. I was no longer a victim. I was a man with a weapon, and I knew with every fiber of my being exactly how I was going to use it. The next morning I woke before dawn in the sterile quiet of the motel room. The fury from the night before had settled into a hard, dense weight in my gut. It was no longer a hot, blinding rage, but a cold, focused resolve. I had the truth. Now I needed a plan. I left Eleanor sleeping peacefully and drove back to our city under the cover of the early morning darkness. My destination was a quiet oak-lined street downtown to the law office of Henderson and Associates. I had known Robert Henderson for nearly 30 years. He was an old-school lawyer, a man of integrity and sharp intellect who had handled the legal work for my small construction business before I retired. His office was a reflection of the man himself, dignified, solid, and serious. It was filled with the comforting scent of old books and leather, a sanctuary of logic and reason in a world that had suddenly gone mad. Mr. Henderson, a man with a full head of silver hair and eyes that missed nothing, greeted me with a firm handshake. He listened patiently without interruption as I laid out the whole ugly story. I told him about the 8 years of quiet encroachments, the financial drain, the systematic erasure of my wife. I described the incident with the shove and the cruel, calculated gaslighting that followed. When I was done, a heavy silence filled the room. I could see the empathy in his expression, but his face remained professional, impassive. "It's a terrible situation, James," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. "But I have learned that in situations like this, a son's wife is only as powerful as the son is weak." "I didn't come here just to tell you a sad story, Robert," I said. "I came here because I have proof." I placed my phone on his large, polished mahogany desk, my hand steady. "I need you to watch this." I pressed play. Mr. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the small screen. I watched his face as he watched the events unfold in my living room. There was no flicker of shock or surprise, only a deepening seriousness. He listened to Jasmine's boastful call with her friend, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He listened to the second, more sinister call, the one that laid out the entire conspiracy. He took out a yellow legal pad and began to take notes, his pen scratching quietly in the silent room. When the recording finished, he didn't speak for a long time. He simply sat back in his large leather chair and steepled his fingers, his gaze distant as he processed the sheer depth of the deception. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes sharp and clear. "James," he began, his tone grave, "what you are dealing with here is twofold. First, there is the issue of tenancy. Because your son and his wife have lived in your home for 8 years, they have established significant tenancy rights even without a written lease. You cannot simply change the locks and throw them out. We would have to follow a formal and potentially lengthy eviction process. He let that sink in before continuing. However, the second issue, the one captured on this recording, is far more serious. This is not a simple family dispute. What your daughter-in-law described on that phone call is a premeditated conspiracy to commit felony fraud. She is plotting to illegally gain power of attorney over your wife through deception, with the express purpose of seizing your assets, namely your home. This elevates the situation from a civil matter to a criminal one. A weight I didn't even know I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. Hearing a man of the law confirm the criminality of her actions was a profound validation. "So what do we do?" I asked. "We act with precision," Mr. Henderson said, leaning forward again. "The absolute most important thing you can do right now is nothing. You cannot confront them. You cannot let them know that you are aware of their plan in any way. That video is our ace in the hole, but right now it's your word against hers about who she was talking to and what she truly meant. A skilled defense lawyer could try to paint it as angry, empty talk. We need more. We need undeniable physical proof." He tapped his pen on the legal pad. She mentioned legal papers. She mentioned a doctor for a mental health evaluation. We need to find those documents. We need names, dates, physical evidence that she has taken concrete steps to enact this plan. Your first mission is to become a detective in your own home. He laid out the strategy. You and Eleanor will return home on Sunday just as you said you would. You will act defeated. You will be quiet, compliant, and most importantly, you will seem completely unaware. Give them a false sense of security. Make them believe their plan is working perfectly. Then you wait for your opportunity. When they are both out of the house, you will conduct a thorough but careful search of their room. Look for paperwork, for letters, for a folder, for anything related to a power of attorney or medical evaluations. Photograph everything you find, but do not take it. We cannot let them know you have been in their space. Once you have that physical evidence, you will bring it to me. Then and only then will we make our move. I left his office an hour later, the cold fury in my gut now channeled into a clear strategic purpose. I came to him with a terrible truth. I left with a battle plan. We returned home on Sunday evening, the air in the car thick with a heavy, unspoken anticipation. I had found the documents. Tucked away in a shoebox at the back of Jasmine's closet was a folder containing a blank power of attorney form printouts of articles about declaring a senior mentally incompetent and the business card of a doctor specializing in geriatric psychology 3 towns over. The final nails for her coffin. As we pulled into the driveway, I gave Eleanor's hand a reassuring squeeze. She looked at me, her eyes full of a fearful trust. She knew this was the night. As per Mr. Henderson's instructions, we played our parts perfectly. We were 2 defeated old people returning from a fruitless trip. We were quiet, we were tired, and we were compliant. Jasmine and David greeted us with a superficial warmth that now seemed utterly grotesque. Jasmine had even cooked dinner, a gesture of control disguised as kindness. We ate in a tense, suffocating silence. After the plates were cleared, I stood up. My heart was a cold, heavy drum in my chest. "David, Jasmine," I said, my voice unnervingly calm. "Your mother and I would like to have a family meeting in the living room." They exchanged a quick, wary glance but followed us in. They sat on the sofa, a portrait of confident condescension. They likely thought this was going to be a conversation about our declining health, a formal surrender. I let them think it. I sat in my armchair directly across from them with Eleanor seated beside me. I began my tone soft and reasonable. "Your mother and I were doing a lot of thinking on our trip. I started letting them lean into the lie. We know we're not getting any younger, and Eleanor's health, well, it's a growing concern. So we wanted to talk to you both openly and honestly about the future." Jasmine's face softened into a mask of perfect, compassionate concern. "Oh, James," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Of course. We've been worried too. We're here for you, for whatever you need." "We're glad to hear that," I said, my eyes fixed on her. "Because our primary concern is making sure Eleanor is well cared for and that this house, our home, stays in the family." "Absolutely," Jasmine said, nodding eagerly. David, my son, sat beside her, a silent, supportive echo. "This is our forever home. We would never dream of being anywhere else. We want to be here to take care of you both for as long as you need us." She was weaving the rope for her own hanging, and she had no idea. I let her words hang in the air for a moment. Then without another word, I stood up, picked up the television remote from the end table, and turned on the large screen. David and Jasmine looked at each other, a flicker of confusion in their eyes. The screen lit up not with a cable news channel or a movie, but with a familiar static wide-angle view of the very room in which they were sitting, seen from the perspective of the old grandfather clock in the corner. The recording began to play. I did not watch the screen. I watched them. At first there was just bewilderment. Then as the footage of Jasmine's boastful phone call to her friend Tiff began, I saw Jasmine's smug expression begin to falter. Her smile tightened, then vanished completely. The color drained from her face, leaving a pale, waxy sheen. Her hand, which had been resting casually on David's knee, clenched into a tight fist. David's journey was different. He watched his brow furrowed in confusion, then a deep, wounded shame washed over his features as he heard Jasmine mock him, heard her brag about how she had him tamed. I saw him flinch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if he had been physically struck. But it was when the second phone call began that his transformation was complete. The call about the power of attorney, the call about the doctor and the mental health evaluation, the call where she laid out her plan to have his own mother committed to a nursing home. The shame on David's face curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. His mouth fell open slightly. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He looked from the screen to the woman sitting next to him, to his mother, whose hand was now covering her mouth, her eyes streaming with silent tears. He was not just seeing his wife's deception. He was seeing his own catastrophic failure, his own weakness, his own complicity in a plot so monstrous he could barely comprehend it. He was seeing the truth. When the video ended, the screen went black. The only sound in this room was the quiet, steady ticking of the grandfather clock, a sound that now felt like a countdown. I let the silence stretch a heavy, crushing blanket of truth. I let them stew in the poison of their own making. Jasmine was frozen, a statue of panic. David was visibly trembling. Finally, I rose from my chair. I did not look at Jasmine. I did not acknowledge her existence. I looked directly at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had so thoroughly broken my heart. My voice when I spoke was not loud, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. David, I said the word as cold and hard as a stone. You have 30 seconds to get that woman and everything that belongs to her out of my house. After 30 seconds, I am calling the police and showing them this video, along with the legal documents I found in her closet. Jasmine finally snapped out of her paralysis. She grabbed David's arm, her voice a desperate, shrill whisper. David, baby, no, it's not what it looks like. He's twisting it. He's trying to break us up. It was just talk, just contingency planning. You know your mother's health? I was just trying to be prepared. You believe me, don't you? Tell him you believe me. David slowly turned his head and looked at her. For the first time, he was not looking at the beautiful, charming woman he loved. He was looking at a stranger, a monster who had planned to destroy his mother. He pulled his arm from her grasp, as if her touch had burned him. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a broken, unrecognizable whisper filled with the agony of a soul that had been shattered. Get out, Jasmine, he said. What? She shrieked. He looked at her, his eyes full of a terrible newfound clarity. I said, get out, he repeated, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. Take your things and get out of my parents' house, now. Jasmine did not go quietly. David's words seemed to flip a switch in her, transforming her from a pleading victim into a cornered animal. A torrent of rage and venom erupted from her. She shrieked, her voice cracking with fury, calling David a spineless mama's boy, calling me a manipulative old fool, calling Eleanor a pathetic, senile creature. She stormed through the house, grabbing her possessions, knocking things over in her wake. It was an ugly, chaotic exit, a final, desperate attempt to inflict as much pain as possible. We stood in silence and watched her go. We did not react. We did not engage. We just watched as she loaded her bags into her car, slammed the door, and sped away, leaving a cloud of exhaust and 8 years of accumulated poison behind her. The storm had finally passed. When the sound of her car faded, a profound, deafening silence descended upon the house. The adrenaline that had sustained us for the last hour vanished, leaving behind a raw, gaping wound. David stood frozen in the middle of the living room, his face a pale, ghostly white. He looked at the empty space where his wife had just stood, and then his eyes fell upon his mother, who was watching him with a look of infinite, heartbreaking sadness. A deep, guttural sob tore from his chest, and he collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. It was the sound of a man's world, completely and utterly shattering. It was the sound of a 40-year-old man finally growing up in the most painful way imaginable. Eleanor started to move toward him, her maternal instincts taking over, but I gently put a hand on her arm and shook my head. This was something that had to happen between a father and his son. I sat down in the armchair across from him and waited for the first wave of his grief to pass. After a long time, he looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, filled with a shame so deep it was hard to look at. "Dad," he choked out. "I'm so sorry. I was so blind. I didn't see. I didn't protect her. I didn't protect you." "I know, son," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "but you see it now. That's what matters. There would be time for forgiveness later. That night was for truth. We sat there for hours, talking more honestly than we had in a decade as the wreckage of our family life lay all around us. The weeks that followed were a blur of necessary, painful actions. Mr. Henderson handled the legal side with quiet efficiency. A formal restraining order was filed against Jasmine, ensuring she could not come near the house or Eleanor. David, with our full support, filed for divorce and for sole custody of Noah, using the video as undeniable evidence of Jasmine's character and her plans for his mother. The house itself began to heal. Eleanor slowly but surely started to reclaim her space. Her family photos went back up on the walls. The scent of her baking once again filled the kitchen. The sound of classical music replaced the angry chatter of reality television. The house began to feel like our own again. 3 months later, David and Noah came for Sunday dinner. The change was remarkable. He did not arrive empty-handed like a guest at a hotel. He brought groceries. He stood beside me in the kitchen, helping to prepare the meal, asking for Eleanor's advice on the seasoning. He was no longer the entitled boy we had enabled for so long. He was a man, a father humbled and rebuilt. We ate dinner together, the four of us, and the conversation was quiet, respectful, and real. The boundaries were clear. He was our son, whom we loved, but he was also a guest in our home, and he acted with the grace and respect that role required. That evening, after they had left, Eleanor and I sat on the front porch swing, the cool night air, a welcome balm. For a long time, we just sat in a comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the crickets, watching the stars begin to appear in the twilight sky. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and I took her hand in mine. It felt strong and steady. The peace we felt was not the fragile, artificial quiet we had endured for years. It was a deep, powerful, and hard-won tranquility. It was the peace that comes from choosing truth over comfort and dignity over silence. Our sanctuary was ours, once more. A lesson from the story. True kindness is not about limitless giving. It is about teaching others how to respect your boundaries. Protecting your peace is not selfish. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation, ensuring your sanctuary is never mistaken for public ground. It's where love and dignity live.